Welcome to Retail Crime Uncovered, your go-to podcast for anything and everything retail crime related, sponsored by Sekura Global. Here is your host, Professor Emmeline Taylor.
Welcome to this super special episode of Retail Crime Uncovered. We're going to go in depth looking at facial recognition. What are the issues that we should be thinking about? Can it be used ethically, or is the technology just still too unreliable? I'll also be looking to Mexico as part of our in-country focus, and of course catching up with Dr. Grant Drawve, our USA correspondent, and Louise Eccles here in the UK.
Spotlight.
We've been hearing so much about facial recognition in retail recently, particularly in the UK. It's being backed by the government, by the police. In other regions, it's just seen as not being compliant with data protection or even the ethics of whether we should be surveilling everyday people. So today we're going to go in depth and explore some of those issues. I'll be speaking to Big Brother Watch, who are very against the technology. I'll be talking to Tony Porter, who is the former surveillance camera commissioner in the UK, who argues that it can be used ethically and responsibly. But first of all, I took to the street and I asked some customers, what do they think? Some shops are now using facial recognition in store to try and match people against known criminals. What do you think of that?
I think it's a good idea. I think given where we live today, especially in London, in the major cities where crime rate is quite high, I think it's quite important to have something like that to protect ourselves against known criminals that could, loss of goods or anything like that. I think it's quite important. I think what's important is if the police had access to this, rather than, let's just say, a big supermarket chain like Asda or Sainsbury's, I'd feel more safe. But if it's just Asda, Sainsbury's, etc., I'd feel a bit concerned if they're looking to essentially maybe sell my data, which is also a big thing at the moment.
Did you know that some shops are now using facial recognition to identify people as they come in store with a view to try and stop shoplifting?
I did not know.
You didn't know that?
No.
What's your initial thoughts?
Bit of an invasion of privacy, I guess.
Yeah.
Are they storing and putting this in a database somewhere?
That's a good question, definitely.
They already have my face, and then they're they keep
are they
on.
scanning it to find?
So it'd be known offenders would be their database. Okay. And there's different ways it's being done. So one is that they will then use the image and match it against the police national database. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The other way, they're compiling their own databases and then using that to trigger if somebody comes in store.
Don't like the sound of that.
Don't like the sound of it. Would it put you off a particular store?
Yeah, I might just stick to the internet shopping. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it would literally stop you maybe going in a shop?
Potentially, yeah.
I think I don't really care that much, no.
Okay.
I'd still go in, yeah. But I'd be
crazy, man.
I'd be wary, yeah.
Did you know that some shops are using facial recognition?
I did know that, yeah.
You did?
Yes.
Okay. What do you think of it?
It's worrying for me. I work in cybersecurity myself, and
No way.
Knowing how secure companies tend to be, the fact that they are using facial recognition is concerning.
Yeah, and so you're worried about the data, the images maybe being leaked, or what would your main concern be?
I think we're completely losing the concept of privacy in the world, and this is sort of the dystopian future that I think no one should be part of.
Would it stop you from going into a shop if you knew they were using...
It would.
Some shops are saying, we're not storing the images. If there's not a match, it's deleted straight away. Does that alleviate any concerns?
No, it doesn't. It's... I don't think this is the type of society we want to be part of. There's been proof time and time again that sort of the what they say is happening might not always be the case. Yeah. We do not have any way of independently verifying that. Just taking a company by their word, sadly, isn't sort of good enough these days.
Some people are concerned that the technology is not very accurate at the moment. So there's lots of false positives, particularly if you're a person of colour, if you're a woman. Do you share those concerns that it might be picking out the wrong people?
I do, and we are nowhere near developing systems that would actually not have bias. Every system that we build is sort of, we incorporate our own bias into any system we build. There's no way to sort of to protect against that. You can't sort of use your own bias to correct bias either. Therefore, you shouldn't ever be using technology for things it really shouldn't be used for. You can't ever, those safeguards simply don't exist to make that okay.
That's fascinating, because we often think of the algorithm as being completely neutral, but for you think even the algorithm is fed with bias from the outset.
It is. The algorithm was created by humans, and by our nature, we all have our own biases that will always be part of any work product we create.
So you're 15, you're out in London. Will you be visiting any of the shops while you're here?
Yes, a lot.
A lot. Did you know that some shops are now using facial recognition?
No, I didn't.
Okay, what do you think of that?
I think it's a very complicated topic because you wouldn't know what other people would do with your image, where it can end up. Yeah.
Would you be concerned about that? Are you worried that maybe your image is going to be used in ways you've not consented to?
Yes.
In London at the moment, it's quite widely publicised. We've got a real issue with theft. So people going into stores, stealing, hundreds of pounds worth of goods. And so the businesses are saying we need facial recognition to prevent that level of crime, to identify the offenders. But do you think it's just not worth the risk for those businesses if it's putting people like you off going in?
Yeah, I don't think it's worth it.
I'm joined now by Mark Johnson from Big Brother Watch. They're a civil liberties organisation here in the UK, and he's been really looking into the issues around facial recognition. Mark, welcome. This is such a big topic at the moment in the UK, and of course, there's going to be issues, there's going to be advocates. What's your perspective? What should we be worried about?
Well, it is a hot topic. About half an hour before we've recorded this, there's been a question on it in the House of Lords. There was a question in the House of Commons yesterday.
Right.
So you can see that it's really kind of like still very much at the forefront of the political agenda. From our perspective, I mean, live facial recognition, so that is, essentially facial recognition which scans crowds, and scans the faces of every single person in shot. We don't think that that's compatible with, the kind of human rights standards that we would expect in a liberal democracy like the UK. There are countries and jurisdictions around the world that are either banning or restricting the use of live facial recognition. So a really good example of that is the EU's AI Act, which essentially prohibits live facial recognition except for in a few very select circumstances. We think that's, certainly a much better situation than we're in here in the UK, where the police have been given certainly kind of free rein by the previous government. We're yet to see the kind of approach that the new government take, but we hope it will be kind of more rights respecting. And we think the current situation is untenable at the moment. The police can basically write their own rules. There is a great deal of legal uncertainty because of the fact that essentially there is no primary legislation that kind of governs how this technology is used.
That's quite often the case, isn't it? That the legislation lags so far behind the rapid sort of development of these really sophisticated technologies. Now, you talked about live facial recognition. In retail, is it more what's been described as passive? So it's after the event, it's matching an offender who has done something wrong to the police national database. Are there the same concerns?
So there are two different uses in the retail sector. One is live facial recognition, which is predominantly used by kind of private vendors, and they will provide the systems for retailers, and that is, as I described, essentially scanning everybody's faces in shot. And then, comparing those faces against a watch list and then looking for people of interest. That's the one we're more concerned with, but there are also issues with the other, which is retrospective facial recognition. It's more as you describe, which is, using CCTV footage after a crime has been committed and then, working with the police to, use facial recognition technology retrospectively to find potential perpetrators. In terms of how that works, I mean, it is possible that we think it is possible that could be used in a kind of human rights compliant way, because if you think about it, it's slightly different. It's not scanning the faces of scores and scores of innocent people and essentially in quick time scraping their biometric data. It's looking for a particular person.
Yeah.
That being said, there are no safeguards really around that either, apart from very rudimentary kind of data protection law and human rights law. So we think that should be addressed with legislation as well, and that safeguards should be put in, because at the moment there are just not the safeguards that are needed. And in fact, the previous government had spoken about integrating the passport database with retrospective facial recognition systems, and that would be an enormous escalation.
Now, one of the things I read a lot about is the fear of false positives, and a lot of the documentation, or a lot of the stories on this says that it's particularly bad at distinguishing between darker skin. So you have a racial bias that is built into the algorithms, and also with women, that some of these algorithms haven't been trained on female faces as much. Is that still a concern? Because some of the vendors are saying it's now, almost 100% accurate.
Yeah, no, it is still a concern for sure. In terms of different academic studies that have looked at this, many of them have found kind of statistically significant biases against some of the groups that you mentioned. We had a woman, a teenager actually, 19-year-old, in a Home Bargains in Manchester, going to the store, was pulled over by security, told that she was flagged by the system, and she had done nothing wrong at all. She was, quite shaken up by the experience, I guess, and told that she was a shoplifter. She had her bag searched. She was told that she couldn't come into any of the stores that used that particular company's system. And then it later transpired that she was misidentified as well, and there's there's legal action there going on too. So
because I think one of the worries is that when we think about technology, we often presume that it's neutral, and we don't think that it would ever have any bias, and it doesn't have the subjectivities of people. And so when you do have that misidentification, I imagine the people, they will just take that at face value, pardon the pun, but rather than scrutinise it and question the technology. And I think that's where there's a real worry there, I think. What do you think that will have done to, sort of like customers' view of that particular business?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, these two cases are, particularly interesting cases because they've, resulted in legal action in both cases. But it's interesting that this year we've had more and more people get in touch with us, maybe don't want to escalate their concern as far as that, but have been misidentified or have had different issues with the system, and it's increasing. And many of these cases are happening in the private retail sector. And with the private, companies that are providing these systems, there isn't the same level of accountability as when the state uses it. So although there are problems in both cases, we might hear from these companies, oh yeah, it's 100% accurate, but are they going to open up their algorithms for kind of public scrutiny? No, they're certainly not going to. It's a real concern. It's an issue that obviously, and I do understand that retailers, have had to face up to an increase in shoplifting recently, but also they have to be aware of these considerations and the problems that they can face, whether it's legally or even reputationally later down the track. So these are issues that retailers have to kind of get to grips with, but also, as I said before, something the government really needs to think about as well.
Mark, fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm joined now by none other than Tony Porter. He's the former Surveillance Camera Commissioner advising the UK government, and he's now the Chief Privacy Officer for Coresight. Hi, Tony. I've just been speaking to Big Brother Watch about facial recognition in retail specifically, and not surprisingly, there's a few concerns about whether it can be used ethically. One of the things they raised was the absence of a legal framework. What is the legislative sort of parameters of using facial recognition?
It's a really fair point. There is no specific law enabling or disallowing the use of facial recognition. So let's put that straight out there. But what does govern it is primarily the Data Protection Act. And it's what we do, it's called sensitive biometric processing. So without getting too into the guts of the law, basically, you have to have legal grounds to process. That's under Article 6 of the Act. And there has to be conditions that allow it. So let's say that's Article 9, which it is. Now, in the UK, there has been focus by the ICO, the Information Commissioner, on specific use of face recognition in retail. And in that particular case, they agreed that there was a substantial public interest. And I think that's what your listeners need to keep a real close eye on. And I think it's what Big Brother Watch need to consider. Because if you look at retail theft It isn't the case of a Mars bar being nicked from a corner shop, so we're going to biometrically process people's faces. It's a multi-million pound industry that's bringing our shops and our high streets down to its knees. And it's something that's growing exponentially. So whilst I have some sympathy that there must be laws, the data system must be protected, but I have very little sympathy for the argument that we shouldn't do everything we can to support law enforcement in protecting our shops, our high streets, and our people. So that's a real key issue for me.
I mean, one of the examples that Mark gave was around, the concern of false positives, and particularly for, ethnic minorities, perhaps. So he gave an example of, a young female who'd been wrongly accused based on an incorrect facial matching. She was a person of colour. Should we still be concerned about these false positives, or do you think the technology has advanced as much as we need it to?
One, we always have to be concerned of false positives. We have to make sure that the software is not biased. They call it bias, but an algorithm can't be biased. Humans can be. It's called unfairness of output. But in terms of false positive, let's just compare and contrast. The company that I work for, and there's one or two others, we hit on independent national testing an accuracy rate of 99%.
Wow,
Now,
okay.
I was just reading an Australian review on police lineups. That's when the bad guy is on the lineup, and there's a 50% failure rate. So let's have some sense of proportion here. This software is a game changer in terms of identifying bad guys. Now, where I do have some sympathy with Big Brother Watch is that if this stuff is being used in the wild, and that means if it's being used where lots and lots of people are, difficult lighting conditions, difficult angle rake, then we need to make sure that the software is as good as it possibly can be. And there is some rubbish out there, Emmeline. And it may be that Big Brother Watch's position is referencing the rubbish, and I would accept that the public need protected. But for example, my company, and there are one or two others that, and particularly Coresight, is referenced by the National Institute of Science and Technology in America, which is the golden voice on this, as having an almost indiscernible bias rate. That means the difference between black men, white men, black women, white women, and a range of races in between is indiscernible.
Is that live facial recognition, or is this retrospective?
That's in live facial recognition. There are issues, however, and we've got to be completely transparent. There is unfairness in the software, i.e. that means there is a very small percentage that there will be an error rate. But compare and contrast that with a 50% error rate of a human on a police lineup. We have to recognise here that what this software does, it protects the public in areas of high volume. And I'm very proud to say that this software protects the public evenly. It's not unfair. You have to understand the advancement of the technology in the software, the areas it can be used to protect people, the way it can be used as a force for good, but more particularly the way that it's now almost bias unfairness free. And I think what's not to like? If we can deliver that in a safe zone, that's great.
Is that possibly to do with that there's different providers, aren't there? And so perhaps we're comparing apples and pears, and some of the technology that's being used isn't, does have that bias, and it doesn't, it's not got the safeguards around it.
There needs to be context to this. What would you rather you have, your police or your security agencies distilling 1 million people into 10 possibles, and then identifying that out of those 10 possibles, 9 were bad guys and 1 shouldn't have been there? That is a real result. That's an extremely good result. That having been said, we've got to be very, very careful always with the issue of race, gender in a complex multicultural society, that there is no bias. And if there is bias, it's identified, it's transparent, the operator is aware of it, and the people making decisions can actually take the right decision as a result of it.
And so I'm just thinking, what would be the advice then to retailers who are considering that they might implement facial recognition? Is this about training for staff to always be cognizant that there could be these bias issues, or is it that you only use it in certain locations? What would your suggestion be?
The advice would be, if you're dealing with a company that sells Ask them what their independent testing is like. Ask them what their bias ratio is like. Ask them what their accuracy portfolio is like. Ask them what their security and privacy posture is like. Is their software geared up to enable complete and utter compliance with GDPR? Ask them what their ethical principles are. Do they have an ethical policy? Ask them, are they complying with new modern emerging standards, whether that's AI quality management systems that focus on transparency, explainability. Can you explain your black box? Most people have not got a clue what you're about. I mean, who knows what's in a Fire Stick? And Amazon, nobody. Who knows what's in your sat nav in the car? Nobody. But I'll tell you what, new legislation is emerging that force people like companies from mine to have to be able to explain exactly what's the data, how do you come up with that result, why should we trust that result? Now, this is above and beyond what's going on anywhere else. And I think I just want people like Big Brother Watch, who I think did a great job. Liberty did a great job in one of the court cases 4 or 5 years ago, Bridges v South Wales Police. But we have to move on. We can't be Luddite. We have to know that we can protect people with technology. And Emmeline, I know that you're an expert on retail crime. You know the numbers, you know the figures, you know the risks to the public. I know that if I was to push you, you know there's people, retailers that are subject to extreme violence, and there is retailers subject to extreme theft that's bringing the businesses down. We can help protect that in a way that guards the rights of the citizen.
And so, Tony, you're a former police officer. Is that, what else would you suggest? Facial recognition, presumably it's not going to be the panacea. It won't solve those high levels of crime we're seeing all over the world. Sure. What else needs to go alongside that? Thinking about police resources are so limited.
Yeah, there has to be prioritization by the police that shoplifting is important. I retired as a senior commander in the police, but when I was on the ground, it was not prioritized. I was never really sure whether we attended shoplifting. I was thinking, well, it's a crime, but nobody is really fired up about it. That has to change. I think government needs to fast track the laws they're talking about, protecting the retailers. I think sentencing has to reflect the fact that it's not just a theft of a video or what have you. It's a targeted attack on our retailers who keep our high streets alive.
Newscast.
And now it's time to hop over the pond and get all of the USA retail crime trending news. Hey, Grant, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you doing today?
Really good, thank you. We've been talking a lot about facial recognition today. Is that something that's getting big in the US? What's happening over there?
It is, and it's growing, and you can see it in the news. It's growing beyond almost the regulation. So it's growing very quickly, and regulation hasn't really caught up to it. And that's where we've seen it in the news. Of late 2023, Rite Aid made the news for their implementation of facial recognition. Ultimately resulted in a 5-year ban from them ever touching it again, based on the practices of how they were using it and the targeting of minorities, to where they have a 5-year ban that the FTC put in place. It's still being used though, and it's growing. I think so. That's the balance that the US is trying to deal with now, is the privacy oversight side of it, as well as retailers are going to use it. They need to turn to technology.
Do you think the customers then are just going to be so put off from that sort of landmark ruling that, it's got this inherent bias, it sounds like?
And that's the danger with a lot of our technology, is the bias in and how it's being trained and how it's being used. It depends. I mean, I have a smartphone. I use the facial recognition to unlock my phone daily. So it is one of those, it's a give and take. We go through a lot of our stores now and they have cameras and displays so you can see it being actively used. And sometimes that makes it easier. So if you have a membership to a certain retailer, you can check out quicker sometimes. So it is a give and take, and the customer experience can change. But at the other end, there is this data privacy, the biometric side, that's not being discussed heavily enough, to where there is going to be a need to balance that as we continue.
That's so interesting, that sort of, you're rewarded for your loyalty, but at the same time, you're surrendering a certain amount of your data. And I guess the real crux of this argument is, how good are these companies going to be at safeguarding that data, particularly when it's something so sensitive as your face?
Of course, and that's where I take from the policing background. Of police have done this for a while too, and even in their predictive policing software. But if you think about it in the same regards, it's still the bias that's in it. So how is it being implemented and how it's being used? So it can be used splendidly well. It's just how is it being used in practice? So the tech is there, but you're going to have false positives. So how do you respond to that, and how are you using it internally in terms of operations? It's going to be huge to that. So if you want to keep that confidence in the consumer, you have to have that data privacy part to it and be transparent what you're using it for and what you're not using it for.
Yeah, transparency, that's really key. And so, Grant, what else is happening in the US? What's trending over there in terms of retail crime?
California and New York are leading the way in terms of their state bills of how they handle workplace violence.
Oh, okay. So what's been happening? Is there new legislation?
In late 2023, California passed a State Bill 553 that's focused on workplace violence. So it's truly retailers that I believe it's 10 employees or more. They have to develop a workplace violence training program, how to respond to it, how to record some of those incidents when they do, and set up a lot of parameters in place as they go forward. And it's supposed to start July 1, 2024, so just around the corner. But it's supposed to have all of these safeguards in place and planning and do risk assessments of how risky and how much crime should you expect, but also the recording of that is a big deal too as well.
So you're just getting about 6 months notice of that being passed and then having to implement it. Are they given almost like a blueprint or, guidance on what this should look like?
Generally, they know what they need to, but with any new program, there's always some ambiguity to it of how it's rolling out and what is needed. It's brand new. So there is going to be that learning curve to it all, but there are expectations that if a retailer is not responding to that or employer is not responding, they're levying fines against those companies. So there is this push to have it implemented. I'm sure there's going to be growing pains with anything new, but there is a big movement that way. And that's why New York's following suit. Just a couple of weeks ago, New York Senate passed a similar one. Each state's going to have a different variation, but we're seeing other states adopting similar practices that puts more of an emphasis back on the retailers or employers to handle workplace violence and violence at their establishments.
Wow. I mean, that's so interesting because, as you and I know, a lot of the root causes of the violence isn't the retailers themselves. This is social issues that are just happening to occur on their premises. Has there been any pushback from retail?
Oh, of course. Except to your point there, it is one of those that stores can only do so much. And you can only target hard so much. You can only add so much security to an establishment. It always comes down to there's going to be crime occurrence. It's not only shoplifting, but we're also focusing on violence. Think about the parking lots and the surrounding environment, but just people interacting. And when you have high volumes of people or in certain situations in certain cities, those interactions are going to be different. So the ability to predict where violence is going to occur comes up, but you're always not going to know what is the true risk. So it's trying to understand and mitigate against that, but sometimes it's unknown. So it is a tough one to plan for when you're predicting individual behavior patterns.
Absolutely. And, I think it's really important that retailers, they've got their ducks in a row, they've mitigated risk, but I think sometimes there's a danger in trying to almost then have the same sort of procedures across everywhere. I don't know, having this sort of blanket approach to me perhaps doesn't seem like the right route.
And that's even have the blanket approach, but then you still have to have people implement based on that. So the training side of this, I think, is going to be incredibly important because everyone's got to be trained up for multiple situations. So no two crimes are ever the same. No two situations are the same. So how you respond to those is very difficult. So thinking through this new implementation and true to your point earlier of a half year to 3/4 of a year implementation window of when this was passed to now they have to have a workplace plan together, the training in line to where everyone's going to have that. It's a lot to ask when thinking through the actual nature of violence and how you respond to it and everything to that.
Definitely. Wow. That's certainly one to watch. And, as you say, it sounds like that's quickly going to spread across all the states with similar legislation, slight variations, but a similar sort of emphasis on retailers sort of taking responsibility for violence on their premises. Grant, it's been amazing. I've learned so much just in the last 10 minutes. It's incredible to hear what's happening in the US. Thank you. And I can't wait to talk to you in the next episode.
Thank you. Looking forward to it as well.
NEWSCAST.
So I'm joined now by Louise Eccles. She's the consumer affairs editor at the Sunday Times, no less, and is a UK correspondent for Retail Crime Uncovered. Welcome, Louise. So what's been happening in the UK? In case people haven't noticed, we've got a new government. Early on in the King's speech, they've outlined two key pieces of legislation. So one being repealing the 2014 piece of legislation that downgraded the seriousness of theft of less than £200. And then we've also seen the commitment to the standalone offence for assaulting a shop worker. What do you think the response from the industry is going to be?
I think it's going to be very well received. I mean, from what we hear from readers, they think that the laws are far too soft on shoplifting. It was once something that you just read about in the media, and it's now something that they see on their local high streets every week.
Yeah.
I've certainly seen a couple of incidents just in the last 2 weeks myself.
Really? Where was
in
that?
Little Waitrose.
No.
Twice, yeah, and once in Co-op.
And was it like a thief that, is maybe stealing to sell on, or was it somebody, just taking something for their own use? Could you tell from...
Yeah, I think there was a mixture of both, actually. In the Little Waitrose, it was someone clearing the shelves into a rucksack.
No.
And I went to the shop assistant at the front and I said, someone's clearing your fridge of coffee drinks, iced lattes. And they just shrugged. What can they do? They were on their own. And then the next one was someone just stealing a couple of bounties in Co-op.
Right.
I'd say that's probably for personal use.
You think so? I mean, yeah, you're not going to go on a big spending spree from the profits of that, I wouldn't have thought. But it just shows how casual it seems now, isn't it? It's just everywhere.
Absolutely. It's become a bit of a free-for-all. And that's why I think that people will welcome the fact that the £200 limit. There'll be changes to that, because shoplifting, if it's worth under £200, really has become such a trivial crime. And that's not just because the sentencing was so low. As soon as they lowered the sentencing and made it a minor offence, I think the police changed their attitude too. They've got serious crime to tackle, so why would they go after something now considered really low value minor crime?
And I always thought with that £200, it impacts different retailers differently. So £200 in, a homeware store or, a department store is quite low. But for groceries, it takes a lot to get to that £200. You are clearing entire shelves of bounties and, caffeinated drinks and things. So it just seems a bit arbitrary, perhaps, to have that threshold.
Absolutely. And also I would have thought that most shoplifting is under £200.
Yeah.
So it just suddenly meant that shoplifting generically was a low priority, was a minor crime.
I think I read that actually from the Sentencing Council, that it's over 90% of offences are under £200. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Wow. So do you think, that commitment, do you think Labour are actually going to, sort of take the bull by the horns and really try and stamp out shop theft?
I think that they can change the law. I think we need so much help now for retailers to enforce the law, don't we? Because they can change the law, but how do we implement it? It's so widespread now that we kind of need everyone to get on board, don't we? We need the police to be prioritising it, and that really seems to vary force by force.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that came out so strongly from the previous policing minister was around facial recognition. I'm not convinced that customers are quite ready to accept facial recognition. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that most people just want transparency over how it's being used and the potential pitfalls of that. And I think that's what makes us uncomfortable, is let's face it, it's already being used all the time, including by the police. They're comparing a mugshot of someone with a live camera all the time already. And I know they want to do that more for retail crime. I think on the face of it, most of our readers seem to be supportive of any measures that the police need to tackle this. They will say to themselves, well, I'm innocent. I don't have anything to hide if I'm in a shop. But is it possible that innocent people will be stopped? That's one of the concerns. And I don't think that's been properly addressed. I don't think we're always given the insight, the research that they've conducted or access to the discussions they've had that have obviously reassured themselves that won't happen.
Yeah.
I think keeping that kind of debate behind closed doors is when we all start to get a bit suspicious of Big Brother.
Exactly. And do you think it like the acceptability or the tolerance for this type of technology. Do you think it varies by consumer? So, maybe if you are white, middle class, shopping Waitrose, you're going to be less concerned than if perhaps you're a young black man and you feel that maybe the technology could unfairly pick you out from a crowd.
Absolutely. I think people will be worried, won't they, about racial profiling because it has been shown to do that before in academic research. And that's why we need to be transparent and say, okay, if you need these powers, I'm sure most people would be supportive of any powers to tackle such widespread criminality, but show us, tell us that it can be trusted.
Yeah. So there's a particular case in England that a lot of retailers have been following. I know that you're familiar with the case of Narinder Kaur. She's also known as Nina Tiara, a one-woman crime wave, and her sentencing is due. What can you tell us about this case?
Yeah, I mean, she stole from over 1,000 shops, and the method she was using really is tried and tested. I remember customers doing this 20 years ago when I worked in Dorothy Perkins and Alders.
Really?
Absolute classic. So they will steal an item and then they'll bring it back into the shop. Sometimes just hours later, and they will say that they want a refund. Now, most shops will only offer an exchange, but in this circumstance, it seems she got the mixture of exchanges and refunds to a huge value of money over a very long period of time, and was only caught when police looked through her bank statements and saw that she was getting this massive volume of refunds.
Because it's over £500,000 that she amassed, and clearly wasn't through need. When the police went to her house, she had over £100,000 in cash. That's just incredible. Now, you said this used to happen, years ago in Dorothy Perkins. Have retailers learnt the lesson then around returns fraud?
Well, I find it absolutely extraordinary that they didn't do more to prevent this and do more on traceability.
Yep.
So if you look at Next, they're really the complete outliers in the industry. And now, if you take back an item, you don't even need the receipt. They will scan the barcode, I'm sure people know, of an individual item. So they'll scan the barcode of your T-shirt, and they will be able to see where you purchased it and when you purchased it. And that pretty much eradicates this kind of crime.
Yeah.
It's such a great idea, and they seem to be, you'll be able to tell me perhaps, that one of the only ones in the industry, maybe the only one in the industry that has this system. So if they have this technology, they clearly had the foresight, they saw this happening years ago, and they said, right, we're going to invest, we're going to stop this crime. And they pretty much have, because if you look at the list of shops that this criminal went to, the Kaur went to, it doesn't include Next. Of course it doesn't.
Yeah, and it's got so many household high street names, hasn't it?
John Lewis, TK Maxx, M&S, like all of Monsoon, Boots, and they don't have this technology.
Yeah. We actually had Stuart Farrell, the head of loss prevention from Next, on Retail Crime Uncovered, talking about that unique ID barcode that they use. And it just seems like a game changer. You can suddenly see the entire journey of each individual item. But it just seems mind-boggling that, this sort of loophole hasn't been closed. And maybe it's that classic trying to balance the customer experience with your honest customers. You don't want too much friction. You don't want to accuse them. But yet it almost just seems too easy to manipulate.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you get it right, it's a better customer experience as well, isn't it? Because the amount of times I've not kept a receipt.
Exactly.
And I work in consumer affairs. Whereas at Next, you just bring back the T-shirt, perhaps a grandmother has bought a wrong size for my daughter and I don't want to let on that I'm about to exchange it. You don't want to ask for the receipt, do you? And yet they know it was purchased by Grandma Helen up in Leeds several weeks ago.
Yeah.
And so it's not a problem. So I actually think that it was a genius move because it's not only stopped this kind of mass refund fraud, but it's also made it easier for customers.
What do you think of when people email you the receipt now? Do you think that's better, maybe saves paper, means you don't lose it? I'm always a bit funny about, I don't want to hang around giving my email address at the till and then I worry that they're going to use it for marketing, but I totally get that, at least then I'm not going to lose it.
I think that saving paper is a complete marketing ploy by the retailers. There's no way they've done that for environmental purposes. Just absolutely no way, because look at the waste in retail.
Yeah,
maybe if they stop packaging everything in individual single-use plastic. I would believe that was for environmental reasons. Having said that, I think it's a transparency thing again. I don't mind digital receipts. I know they're going to use my data, and I know they're going to give me marketing unless I opt out of it. So I think if you go in with your eyes open and they say, look, can we send you a digital receipt? We're going to try and send you marketing, and we're probably going to analyse your data.
Yeah.
Then perhaps people would go, do you know what? I'm happy to do that. Or people would say, do you know, it's not for me. I'll have the paper receipt.
Yeah,
what
definitely.
I don't like is the kind of the sneakiness of it.
Or being forced into it.
Just pop this in here.
Yeah,
or when I've
absolutely
asked
agree.
for paper ones, they say, oh, we don't do that
it
anymore.
Yeah, that happened to me last week. I was really shocked.
Yeah, especially when you can see there's a paper printer next to them.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, they're under pressure from the bosses higher above. You can't blame the individual shop assistants for that one. But yeah, just be transparent about what you're doing there. It's for marketing.
Country focus.
And a new feature on Retail Crime Uncovered is to look at individual regions in the spotlight. So what's happening there in terms of retail? What are the crimes that are occurring? What are the penalties? And for this week's episode, we're going to Mexico. I'm joined by Guillermo. He's an independent consultant. He specialises in crime data. Welcome to Retail Crime Uncovered.
Thank you so much, Emily, for having me here. Delighted to be discussing and talking about different figures on retail crime in Mexico.
So tell us, what is it like there? What sort of issues are presenting themselves?
Well, first of all, as we know, Mexico has become produces this image of a very insecure country. And that's very regretful because, as we know, crime tends to concentrate either in specific places, victims, or sort of, depending on the type of products in this case. So we'll be discussing a little bit of the nuances behind this. But I mean, in general terms, we can see important shifts and reductions over the last 10 years in terms of, regular crimes.
Okay, so reductions. Okay, that sounds quite unusual. So that's across the board. Crime is down in Mexico.
Yeah, but to begin with, in terms of retail crime, let us just, let me provide you with a context of the country. The latest data we have right now, it comes from the economic census that is done every 5 years. We have 4.8 million private economic businesses in Mexico. I'm not including government activities or primary activities like agriculture, fisheries, etc. 95% of these economic units are micro-sized, meaning they employ between 1 and 10 people.
Okay.
And this is very important because this is the kind of, the biggest frequency of economic units in retail. So, I mean, it's like, just to give you an idea, overall, we're talking that 90% of economic units in Mexico are dedicated to retail services.
Okay, and just so I'm clear then, the profile of retail in Mexico is typically small, maybe independent stores rather than big, large corporations and what you might see in the USA, for example.
Exactly.
Interesting.
It's pretty much like family business, grocery stores, that kind of, The Business Crime Victimization Survey in Mexico is conducted every 2 years. The Victimization Survey provides us with estimates related to perceptions of crime and victimization rates. So in terms of what are the perceptions of crime in Mexico? We have in 2022, which is the latest data, this year will be released the new edition of this survey. We have that 1 in every 2 economic units perceive crime and delinquency as their main concern or their main issue. This is even before, high taxes or the economy, like people not being able to buy enough products from their stores.
I was reading something recently about how the cartels were now targeting retail because they saw it as a really easy, low risk activity. Is that something that you're picking up on there, that, there's sort of organised criminal gangs targeting retail?
investigative, we don't have official statistics on that, because as we know, criminal organizations operate in the hidden, in the dark. But I mean, 3 of the latest trends that we see in Mexico, like in terms of crime and that are affecting retail services and other kinds of businesses, relate to, organized crime controlling the primary products, meaning, they extort avocado producers or tomato producers or, this kind of businesses, agricultural businesses, by saying to the stores, now instead of saying you're going to pay me this amount of money, you're going to pay that guy that amount of product at this price. So they're changing the market, they're changing the prices. And this, of course, relates to the inflation in the country. That's one of the biggest, impacts that retail services may be facing now. Second important trend is highway robbery, because obviously this causes products to increase in terms of their prices because of the additional security measures that need to be taken, and cybercrime, which is, it's becoming now a thing in Mexico.
And those highway robberies, is that for particular products or it could be anything?
We know for where the crimes are committed, it's in the center and western part of Mexico. And these regions are familiar for their industry. So we're talking about shoes, clothes, food, and also water is becoming a thing.
Water?
Because of the drought that is being present in this country and in the last few years has been increasing. So now water is becoming like a valuable item to possess and to distribute.
What's the police response like in Mexico? Is retail crime taken seriously if somebody steals from a shop, or if there's, even an armed robbery? What's the police perception like?
It's, I would say, twofold or mixed. There are mixed views on that, because when you see the results on why microeconomic units don't report their crimes, it's not because they consider their crimes as not important. It's because they lack confidence in the authorities. In Mexico, we have 3 levels of government: federal, state, and municipal. So municipal and state police forces are the ones in charge of, preventing and following delinquents and this kind of acts. But unfortunately, most of the detentions are done in flagrancia, which means in the exact moment they're committing the crime. It's very rare that they conduct a criminal investigation in order to, apprehend the responsible people, especially when, they stole some minor merchandise from these shops.
Yeah. So there would be no expectation of an investigation if they're not caught red-handed at the time.
There's no expectation and there's no economic benefit on doing it. Because, since we're talking about very small stores or businesses, they won't, spend 3 to 4 hours reporting a crime, explaining to the authorities in order for nothing to happen. So that's why we have a very huge dark figure of crime in Mexico. 9 out of every 10 crimes in Mexico are not reported to the police or to the authorities.
Wow, gosh. And I thought we had an issue here in the UK with underreporting.